Welcome to tonight's event. I am Lucrece, Rethinking Sexual Violence. My name is Becky Amato, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Urban Democracy Lab, an initiative housed here at NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, and we're dedicated to the process of imagining just, sustainable, and creative urban futures. So you may wonder, what's the connection between the Urban Democracy Lab, Shakespeare, and the topic of sexual violence on university campuses? And that's a good question. When Kristen Horton, who directed this series of Shakespeare's Roman tragedies, approached me and the lab to organize an event that would put a contemporary spin on the issues covered in the plays, I thought immediately about statehood and the birth of the Roman Republic, which have pretty clear links between democracy and Shakespeare's Rome, and certainly issues that challenge us today in a globalized and stratified society. But over time, as the brilliant young actors involved in the plays became entwined in the stories that they were rehearsing, the topics that kept coming to the surface were about womanhood and about rights, particularly the right to one's own body and the right to be heard. Meanwhile, in the news, all of us kept reading about sexual assaults on college campuses, in the military, in high schools, and on the streets of our cities. And then we, of course, read about the movements to stop this kind of violence. It became clear that the themes brought up, especially in the epic poem, The Rape of Lucrece, were just as relevant now as they were in the Roman Republic and in Shakespeare's time and in the many centuries since. We still need to move beyond the idea of women as Lucrece is called, virtuous monuments, ripe for conquest, and sexual assault as an interpersonal matter rather than an issue of social justice. And if we're talking about social justice, then, at least to my mind, we're also talking about democracy. So I'm honored to welcome our panelists tonight, who will help us learn more about the movement against campus sexual violence and how that's unfolding. We'll start from my far left. Mary Beth Seitz Brown is an activist within the anti-sexual and domestic violence movement. She earned her BA in linguistics with honors from Columbia University in May 2014. While at Columbia, Mary Beth was an organizer with No Red Tape, a radical activist group that uses direct action to protest the university's prevention and response to gender violence. Since graduating, she joined the board of Students Active for Ending Rape, also called SAFER, as their communications coordinator, and she has been organizing alumni to join the movement with Columbia Alumni Allied Against Sexual Assault. When she's not educating, agitating, and organizing, Mary Beth works at the Roosevelt Institute, which is a very interesting place, so I want to hear more about it. Vanessa Grigoriadis, no, is that it? Grigoriadis, I keep saying that wrong, is a contributing editor at New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, and Vanity Fair. She is the winner of a National Magazine Award in profile writing and has written about 24 cover stories and 100 print feature articles. She's from the Upper West Side. Sid Chipola is a scholar in sexuality studies with degrees from Yale and Emory, whose recent research has focused on the category of the sexual predator in legal and medical history. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of Medical Humanities and the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences. In addition to her position at Gallatin, she is also a visiting fellow at the DeWitt Wallace Institute of the History of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. So welcome, everybody. Before I leave the stage, I just wanted to remind you that we're going to be tweeting about this event. If you're interested in tweeting, all of you Twitterers out there, it's hashtag I Am Lucrece. So thank you very much.
Hello? There we go. So I just wanted to welcome all of you and say thank you both to Becky and to Kristen for organizing this. And also to say, so I went to see both Julius Caesar and The Rape of Lucrece, and I see a lot of the members of the cast in the audience, so I also want to say thank you to you guys for what you've done to bring these texts to life. And for those of you who are not in the plays and have not seen them, they're still showing. They'll be showing next week, and I really urge you to go see them, and maybe to think about the things we're talking about today. And so to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing, Mary Beth and Vanessa are going to give us a little bit of an idea of the events going on right now, and then we'll go into a discussion section with questions. Okay. You want to start?
Great. So I'm going to be wearing many hats in this conversation. So it's going to be a little confusing, at least for me, so I hope it's not for you all. But I'm here as an activist, but I'm also here as someone who supports current students and survivors through SAFER. And just to give a little background on SAFER, because I think it'll be relevant to our discussion. We were actually founded at Columbia University in 2000, and it's really interesting how this movement has kind of come full circle. And SAFER was founded actually just as a student group that was educating and organizing around sexual assault on college campuses, specifically at Columbia. And other students at other colleges realized that they were doing a pretty good job at getting media attention, at getting their universities to actually change their policy. So students started reaching out to Columbia SAFER activists and said, how can we do what you're doing at our college campus? And that kind of, as activists graduated and went on in their lives, they wanted to sort of translate that activism into a nonprofit. And now SAFER does student activist trainings all around the country and tries to educate students and help them, give them the tools to lead similar movements to reform the college's sexual assault policies. And a really important thing about our approach is that we see sexual violence and the anti-sexual violence movement within an anti-oppression framework, meaning that sexual violence is not an isolated issue. It's specifically and inextricably linked to racism, to homophobia, transphobia, to ableism, and other systems of power and oppression. And so whenever we're doing this work, we have to constantly be connecting sexual violence to those conversations and realizing how members of different communities and identities are specifically affected by those other identities. So we do these trainings. We also do student-centered research, and we've been consulting Senator Gillibrand on the CAS Act, Campus Accountability and Safety Act, which she recently introduced. So that's kind of what we're doing. And it's really interesting to see how SAFER played this role of educating other student activists through their own activism. And that's kind of happening again today with No Red Tape at Columbia, where we see a lot of the activism that's happening at Columbia getting picked up by other activists around the country, picking up their symbols, picking up their demands, but really just building on everything that's come before us and stitching together all of these individual movements, individual stories, individual survivors into what is really full-fledged movement. And I think that's really fascinating, and I'm really excited to talk about that for the rest of the night. We could talk about it all day. So that's sort of SAFER, who I am and why I'm here. I am a survivor of sexual violence, and I think my voice has actually been, automatically brought to the forefront of this issue and this conversation for things that I can't really control. So, I'm white, I'm, a straight woman, and I'm, thin, so there are a lot of things that, I don't have to deal with fat phobia, I don't have to deal with racism, I don't have to deal with homophobia, and so I don't have a lot of these barriers that many survivors have to deal with when they enter this movement. And so I want one thing that we take out of this conversation to be actively looking for voices that aren't as easily heard in this movement, because I think we generally are looking at people that kind of look like me, and there are so many other kinds of experiences out there, and the more voices the better. So that's something to keep in mind throughout the conversation, and just it's goodwill, I think, in general. And so I'm actually really, really excited to see this conversation, because this is kind of exactly what so many student activists are pushing for in their movement. The campus sexual assault movement is not necessarily about, it is about these individual survivors and their experiences, but it's also about rethinking what it really means to be educated and what it means to, be a part of a campus community, but also just a part of all communities. And so a lot of, in addition to sort of the amendments to campus sexual assault policies, student activists are really pushing their colleges to educate their faculty, educate their staff on how to actually compassionately interact with survivors, how to support them inside the classroom, how to support them outside the classroom. And this play has some really triggering content, and it can be really upsetting. And I think we've seen so many professors and so many academic communities kind of downplay the effects of that really difficult content and treat it as something that's in a text as opposed to something that connects to people's lives. And people, I think, and again, a lot of this movement has been again, not just focused on these individual cases, but on the idea of sexual violence as a civil rights issue. And as we're looking at campuses around the country, we see more people saying, this is not just about these high-profile cases. It's about making sure that every single person on a college campus understands what consent is, understands what affirmative consent is, understands how to be an active bystander and intervene if they see a potentially dangerous or a dangerous situation at a party or a social event. So we're really trying to expand the conversation and build on what so many amazing activists have done for years, and really make sure that people are thinking about this issue as something that is both tied to systems of power and oppression, and something that is part of every community, whether you're being covered in all of these headlines or not. So this is a really important conversation, and something that I think so many professors, people who are teaching material that might relate to sexual violence need to kind of learn from. So thank you to the people who are part of this to get this conversation started. And to kind of wrap up my sort of introductory thoughts, I think the title of this conversation is Rethinking Sexual Violence. And I think we want to connect it also to, as I mentioned earlier, rethinking education. So what does it mean to be educated in this country? And a lot of people think of going to college as you take exams, you write papers, and at the end of 4 years you get a piece of paper that hopefully gets you a job. And as for a lot of reasons that's not necessarily the case. But we also know that there's so much more to a college education than those things. And I think we see education as a process of creating the kind of citizens that we want in our country and in our communities. So, again, it's not about, a lot of people don't go to college just to know specific things about chemistry. They go for the experience to gain social skills and hopefully to develop a sort of sense of moral responsibility, civic responsibility that connects intellectual issues to what it means to be a citizen and what it means to relate to others, which is a plug to the democracy theme running here. And so I hope, I think we've thought about, it's easy to think about how literature might connect to democracy, and how political science may connect to democracy, and how learning how to be a good writer and a critical thinker and a good communicator are going to be useful for being a good citizen. But for a really long time, we've left the idea of consent out of that conversation. And if we want to create moral citizens who are contributing to positive, healthy, vibrant communities, we have to constantly and really meaningfully address consent, and not just in a 1 hour orientation or a 1 hour workshop at the beginning of your 4 years, which you then go on to forget within hours, but as something that is an ongoing conversation in its own right, but also connected to the material that you're discussing in the classroom. So, if you're reading, a scene from a novel that depicts sexual violence, then you have to approach that conversation with a mindset that values consent and values compassion. And if you're in a psychology class and you're going to be discussing issues of post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of students in your class might be dealing with that and might have histories of trauma. And I think that's something that's really exciting about this movement, is more student activists are really calling for those kinds of reforms to train faculty to be able to have those conversations. Because ultimately, if you're able to have the conversation that hopefully we'll all have together tonight, throughout 4 years, maybe that will undo the 18 years of rape culture that has kind of been feeding all of our ideas of consent before people arrive at college. So, yeah, I think ultimately what, the solution to, or the things that student activists are looking for are really hard to list off, and it's hard to kind of give a concrete set of, once we've done X, Y, and Z, then the problem is solved. But what people are working towards is a culture of compassion, a culture where you can empathize with other people and feel something even for them, even if you haven't gone through those experiences. And so when we rethink sexual violence and we connect it to the campus sexual assault discussion and movement, we're also rethinking what it means to be educated. And hopefully after 4 years of college education, we've created compassionate individuals who understand and practice consent in a way that respects the bodily autonomy of everyone on campus, everyone in that community, and just everyone in general. So I think we're going to discuss that, topic and a whole lot of other topics. We've got a lot of good things to talk about. So that's kind of my background on Safer and me, and how I approach this conversation and why I think it relates to this play. And I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa now.
Hello. Yes, everybody can hear me. So I'm a journalist, and not an activist. But I think that journalists have played a large role in setting forth what people in this movement are saying. And Mary Beth is right. I mean, this is a full-fledged movement. There's nothing else you can possibly call it at this point. I also think it's really one of the most exciting youth movements we've seen in this country in a long time, particularly among women who do make up a majority of the people who are involved. And for feminists who have been fighting for wage drivers for a very long time, this is incredibly exciting to see that this conversation is getting into the mainstream at the level that it has. So, as a journalist, I think my first impression was just the images that are coming out of the movement. And I think that we can all agree that we were discussing earlier, the two most indelible images are coming out of Columbia. The first one being the red tape, particularly that people wore on their caps in graduation at different universities across the country. But as Mary Beth talked about, this was a group that started at Columbia in 2000 that started using red tape symbolically. And then, of course, Am Lucrece's Am Lucrece project and the way that that's been translated across the country and become really, just one of the most powerful social justice images that I can recall, at least in the last decade. So, I would say that the first thing I was drawn to was the way that people have been so effective at using these personal narratives to move the needle in the media. And obviously, like many of us, began reading these horror tales online, beginning with a very moving story that Angie Epifano wrote in Amherst, when she was a student at Amherst, the way that she was treated by the school. And I think in June I read a story that was on New York Magazine's website, and I think it happened a few years ago, about a woman at Yale who was drugged, and she had this experience of just having this one memory, like a flashbulb pop, that she was crouched at the top of the stairs like an animal, and that was all that she remembered from that night. And I thought, I think I would like to do a story about this now. This is really stuff that is getting so deep into people's psyches. In terms, you can't really think about this for more than a little while before having it affect you. I think that that's also something that's been so significant here, is not only the visual images, but the stories and the fact that because of the online medium, and I hate to say it, because the internet, this works, but like the internet allows us to sit at home with our laptops or our phones and read, these incredibly personal stories that in the 90s would maybe have been in a zine, maybe Stassi would have written something, but you couldn't access the funnel. It's just like an endless river of stories if you really want to get into it. And so I think that the way that those stories and the fact that people have been willing to put their real names, their full real names, and their faces to those stories has completely changed the image of rape and rape victim that we had maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, where what would you think of if you thought of big rape scandal? You wouldn't think Emma and her mattress. You would think Kobe Bryant, powerful man, sitting at a table, lots of lawyers, lots of cameras, he's, being framed, or whatever. Like, there was just a very different, just at the most basic level, a very different image in people's minds in terms of, again, speaking about the mainstream media. So, for me, I think that pop culture is really my area of expertise. That's what I tend to write about. And the idea that we could write about the rape culture aspects of pop culture was obviously very interesting to me. And that while I do recognize what Mary Beth is saying about many different kinds of stories being within this one, area of calling yourself a survivor, I was really interested in, can we have a real conversation as a nation about young women's bodies, the ways that they're exploited, and the music industry, and the fashion industry, and really try to get back to a place where we don't just allow these images to wash over us, and we just don't talk about it like on Jezebel, but this becomes a major mainstream issue for everyone to discuss. And so, that is, I think that middle class and upper middle class women's voices certainly are privileged more than many other kinds of voices, but young women's voices have not been that privileged on the biggest mass levels in terms of, you still have to do your shoot for Maxim where you're half naked, even if you're up for a Golden Globe award. There is still this sense that the body comes first and the ideas come second. So, when I thought, well, how can I do a piece of writing for mainstream magazine that's, kind of complicated and doesn't just say, survivors speak out here, or terrible thing happens at X university. I thought, well, maybe I'll go find these students who are political, but they're writers. I'll find, Gloria Steinem and Andrea Dworkin, and I'll find a poet. There's tons of great poetry about rape, where there's some poets, and And I started to call around and say, well, who should I talk to? And everybody said, well, the people you have to talk to are the activists, because the activists are the people who are actually doing this work and making the change, and they're writing their speeches for the rallies. They're not sitting around writing, these 25-page exegesis on how, it's all well, I think probably so far, but generally action is happening. And if action is happening, you don't have a lot of time to stand back and also reflect on that action. So I thought, I would like to try to capture the actual, what's really going on, which is action going through, Emma Lucrece, this amazing organizer, Zoe Rodolphe Starr, and these two incredible organizers were living in California at the time, from Enwave on campus. And I thought, okay, I'll focus on these people who are a nice swath of what's going on in terms of the action. So I thought I would show tonight some of what this action looks like. I will try. And I'm going to show some slides of what it would look like if you went to one of the rallies in Columbia. I do not know these people, so it will be hard for me to identify them. But you want to say anything, I want to call upon you. But this is, so there were two rallies, and the first one was a bit intimate. It was maybe about 300 students, and I have to say it is really the most affecting experience I've ever had at a protest. It was really unbelievable. And the second one was also unbelievable in its own way. That's what these slides are from, and it was much bigger. It was about 1,000 students, even maybe more, and it was so incredibly well organized. Like, I really have never seen a protest this well organized. So I believe they're promenading from Barnard to Columbia at this point. People gathered at the Barnard gates. There were 28 mattresses, one to represent each survivor, or just a Columbia-affiliated person who had made a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights about Columbia and sexual assault. And as Emma has said many times, these mattresses are easy to carry when you are in a group. I do not know what the project is, do you?
No.
Okay, this is a very good project. Some people put X's on their clothing. I think that sticker said, "Imagine a world without rape," and then was written "create" on top of it. So this is when everybody was lining up. And one really amazing thing about this protest was that so many students from different organizations on campus, different student organizations, gathered to support the survivors and carry these, which was also something that I think is really a rarity in terms of college activism, to see so many different groups come together in solidarity, and that was like, really amazing. These people are carrying mattresses. This is the Shakespeare for you.
Yeah, so this is kind of a similar, actually, relationship between theater and the activism that I think is coming out through the play Am Lucrece, and that these actors realized that rape was being portrayed in the play that they're acting out, and they wanted to support survivors and really connect it to the activism that was going on as a way of being sort of more conscientious about their work.
It started to rain, so there was a lot of holding these mattresses overhead. And this is middle lineup and basically across Broadway here. There were tons of news cameras with those satellites going up. And then they walked up the stairs, we've been to Columbia, kind of walked across the square, and then the stairs go up to like the most important building, which is the library. And all the students from the stairs with their mattresses.
And something about the library is that it's not actually a library, it's the home of the administration, so it's a very symbolic, like, we are, standing in front of you because, you are the decision makers, you're the one that have, for the most part, been hurting survivors and silencing them, so it's kind of symbolic in terms of the space as well.
So you can get a sense of how many people were here. I mean, it started to rain and nobody moved an inch. This was really just such a dramatic and, just profoundly moving, really call to arms. And here's Emma, apparently. She couldn't hear very well, apparently, so the bullhorn is right there. This is it. And this was one of the other organizers.
Ali Ricard.
And now, I don't know why it's not, just some solidarity going on. Oh, right. And there's Mary Beth. And one who spoke who was a, who was our alum whose causes were. It was raining. It really was raining. It really rained. And then, so towards the end of the protest, I believe it was January. And Zoe, the Dolphy Star, kind of said, okay, we're all going this way. And all the students who had the mattresses started carrying them the other direction where they had come from and started walking towards the president's house. And while they were walking, I was walking with some random students who were discussing how President Bollinger had put out I guess it's an editorial or an article about sexual assault at Columbia and the New Republic the same day as this protest, and what exactly he was trying to get across. Sort of a muddled editorial. So then they reached the president's house, and very nicely, I thought, stacked these mattresses. Because really, they should have just maybe thrown them. And stacked these mattresses up in front of his house. And then there was one mattress, and I couldn't figure out, it was the box spring. It was a box spring itself that had the 12 demands.
I think it was just on the bottom.
It was
they
just
flipped
the
it
bottom.
over,
Okay.
yeah.
So one of these, let's see if there's a picture. Here's Zoe. Here are the demands. So unfortunately I don't have a copy of these, but these were the 12 demands that they made that they were asking for from the president. So there was actual purpose to this experience. It was not a performative experience. And things like, allowing survivors to recoup money and lost tuition, and the evaluation of the program every 2 years. And I don't know if I think it was reopening the case, Am Lucrece's case, which they have so far not wanted to do. And there's Ali and Zoe and Emma, and I believe they said this was taking one serious photo, one non-serious photo. And this was really great, which was, I don't know if this was spontaneous or if this was part of the plan, but somebody took some red tape and put, this is a very kind of ornate wood and, iron cast door, and took the red tape and stuck the 12 demands right up there, just in case you didn't read the,
If I can just interject here, so I saw these photos earlier this week, and when I saw this one, the first thing I thought of was the sort of maybe apocryphal Martin Luther nailing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm a giant nerd. Sorry.
No, this was. When I say that this was a well thought out protest, this was a majorly well thought out protest. To be very articulate about. So. I heard that after this experience, I heard they're very nicely stacked. After this protest, the mattresses were taken away very quickly, and that the organization that had their name on the space as the responsible party was going to be fined for taking away these mattresses, which I guess is not really a surprise. I think that maybe I will not read all these quotes. I was going to read you some quotes from the protest, but we can do that another time. And suffice to say, I think, one of the things you've seen at Columbia is the building upon the original foundation, which is the Title IX complaint that was filed by many students. And that complaint brought some media attention and put some pressure on the administration. The mattress when Emma began carrying the mattress, that's put some more pressure on. But now you're at a level where there's an enormous amount of people in the student body who are really focused on this issue and really want to know what Columbia is going to do about it beyond what they've done so far. And so, in a way that I almost think you couldn't have predicted 6 months ago, Columbia has become, really, as far as the East Coast goes, the most, like the fulcrum, basically, of this national movement. And it's really exciting to see where it's going to go next.
There it is. Hello. So we had talked a little earlier, and I had about ways to kind of connect what this is happening directly to the play itself. And one of the questions that I had, so I was meditating also on the title, as Mary Beth said, that the title of this is "I Am Lucrece," which at first blush when I heard it, I said, of course, this is something that's about solidarity, it's about standing up, it's about empowering women to speak. I mean, this is Take Back the Night, this is all these other things. And then when I was sitting and watching the play, and we all went to see it, so I want to hear also your reactions to that experience. I realized that it's more than that. That this is a woman on whose body a republic was founded. And so and this goes a lot to what Mary Beth was saying. There are bigger ideas here about education and about identity, but also, as Vanessa was saying, there are issues about womanhood and the way women's bodies are used still to this day. And so I was wondering sort of what you guys thought about that, about what it means to stand up with Lucrece and what it means to stand up generally as a woman.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing in your question is, that I want to focus on is sort of how people of all genders are affected by sexual violence. But when we think about historically how women's bodies have been used to sort of establish, great civilizations, or advance them, or kind of expand them, I can't not think about just the history of our own nation and how, the rape of Native American women's bodies is so deeply tied to, the founding of our country, and that's a legacy that continues today. Indigenous women experience the highest rates of sexual violence of any community. So, thinking about how bodies are used not only to exert power on the individual, but to exert power over communities and to control women, to control people through their bodies, is not an isolated thing, and it's depressingly, deeply tied to power and how states are able to exert their power, and how just notions of land being inherently invadable and women's bodies being inherently rapeable or conquerable. So I think about Native American women's bodies, and I think about Black women's bodies in terms of slavery, and how so much of, again, our nation's economy, our nation's founding is deeply tied to the rape of Black women's bodies throughout slavery, and controlling them in order to create more property, to create more slaves, but also, again, to sort of dehumanize and rob people of control over their own bodies. So, I think there hasn't been as much of a focus on those histories in the current movement as there should be. But I think, the Atlantic had a great article about what does rape culture look like on an Alaskan reservation. That was very fascinating. So those conversations are happening, sort of. But I think to get back to your original question, what does it mean to say I am Lucrece? What does it mean to stand with all women, all people who experience sexual violence? I think it means, thinking about how this is a historical question, and how you can't stand with all survivors if you're not thinking about, how the fact that we're like sitting in this building is, related to the fact that so much rape has happened against Native American women. So, I think the really interesting way of connecting the play to this movement and to this activism is, I think we should be challenging ourselves to think more about how is, our country, our nation state, how has it been enabled by sexual violence, and constantly challenging ourselves to find that part of the story that I think has been explicitly written out of our history. And in the way that we silence survivors today, I think we've silenced survivors historically, and kind of whitewashed our history to forget about that.
Yeah, I think that, the amazing thing about this movement is that there's not a lot of shame attached to being a rape survivor now, right? And of course, that is part of this play that we are discussing. I'm forgetting where I read this, but somebody said, this happened so quickly. Don't they know that just yesterday people were saying she wore that skirt, she wanted it? Like, how did this happen? It seems like this happened so quickly. And it's true that the image that we see of survivors in the media, and I certainly am complicit in this because I thought it was so fascinating, is so strong and warrior-like and taking on the man. And behind the curtain, of course, there's a lot more going on. And you may have people like me who want to show the strong side because we think it hasn't been shown in the media that much. Or you may have people who feel too weird about talking about the other side, or it makes them uncomfortable. But I think that alleviating that and saying not only is it not your fault, but there shouldn't be guilt, and you should not feel that you cannot express this. This can be a part of your holistic part of your identity and can be like something that you present, and it's not going to hurt you. I mean, interestingly, somebody that I interviewed who was a professor said, many women are willing to come out with their names. Perhaps they think, well, I'm going to work in social justice. I don't mind if my name is out here. Or they think this is the right thing to do. I'm going to do it. Or they think, the culture we're living in today, it doesn't really matter the way that it used to. And it doesn't matter as much for young people. But she said, interestingly, the men who are raped do not want to put their names out there. And it's very, very rare that they can get a man to speak with his full name. And so I think that speaks a lot to the different constructions of femininity and masculinity at this moment, when we are seeing this shifting sands around the construction of rape survivor identity, that it's not really, maybe not the same for guys. I, for one, would love to read a story like that or interview somebody like that, because I think it would be really fascinating. And there have been a few stories, but yeah.
So this is actually a follow-up. I have so many questions. They kind of like pile on each other. But how do you guys think what is happening now is different from? I mean, there's a lot of ways I can see that it's indebted to the legacy of feminist activism and anti-rape activism. And if I'm not wrong, one of the mattresses is being carried by Take Back the Night, which is, that is a movement that has been in a lot of ways ongoing on college campuses for decades. So how is this moment different? Like, what makes this, what's happening now, unique?
Well, I sound like a broken record, but the mainstream media is listening, and the politicians are listening. So it's like if you got the Huffington Post and the New York Times and Senator Gillibrand and McCaskill, and they're going to have a bipartisan group, who else needs to listen? That's who you need to have listen. So I think that in terms of, okay, but why, again, we don't want to say because the internet, but it's allowed activists to network and to pull together disparate experiences at disparate campuses that didn't happen in the 90s. There was not email, so that was not happening. But that's really true. People were not talking to each other. Actions were not coordinated. So, you know, when you think about, I don't know, after Emma came out with the mattress, maybe 20 different schools, different students carried mattresses. I'm assuming that was not coordinated. But this last, Day of Solidarity with Emma on October 29th, that was organized in part by Mary Beth and by Zoe and all these other people at Columbia, was an organized effort at 130 campuses to carry these mattresses. So there was no way in 1995, right? I mean, you would have had to send like a carrier pigeon. Like, I don't know how you would have done that. So,
there were a lot of phone trees, I think. A lot of phone trees.
Yeah.
You are also young.
I think that's true that, it's different because Jill Brand's paying attention. It's different because the New York Times is paying attention. But the reason they're paying attention is because, in part, of Andrea Pino and Annie Clare, who are two activists who started Enrico on Campus, which helped survivors file Title IX complaints against their universities. And they helped me, and they helped Zoe and the rest of our group file our Title IX complaint. And I remember having an initial conversation with them where they kind of sort of shared their approach and their tactics and said, we looked at Amherst, like you mentioned, and we saw that there was Angie Epifano who had her personal story. She had her story, it got a lot of attention, but that was it. There wasn't really the organized movement around it that had sort of policy proposals attached to it. And then you had Yale, which had a lot of policy proposals. It had a lot of the kind of specific interfacing with the administration, but it didn't really have the narrative public face to it. And I think one of the reasons Columbia has been so prominently featured in the media and so successful is because we have both. We have the organized movement that meets probably 6 days a week, if not more, that is kind of taken over these activists' lives, that is so intensely organized and really, really smart. And those people are also sharing their stories. So I think there's you have to have both for people to really understand how this is a movement. Because it's one thing to say like, oh, I heard of this girl, Emma Solkowitz, and like she had this terrible story, and she's carrying this mattress, and it's so amazing, end of sentence. But if you can add to that, it's such an amazing story, and there are so many people that are coming up with like structural, institutional things that need to change so that there are no more Emmas in the future. I think that's what gets people's attention, and that's why this is so different. I think the personal is political adage is an old one, but it's really true here. And I think you see way more activists who are willing to be personal and political at the same time, and that's not very common.
But it has a double-edged. I mean, this is a problematic. When you found a movement on one case or on one person's story, or when those stories get brought to the forefront, and we were talking about this earlier, there's this, and we all feel it, right? One of the reasons it's so interesting to read is there's I think a natural human tendency to want to know what the truth is. And you feel like if you poke at it enough, you can figure out what exactly happened, and then the whole thing will be settled. And I think to me that's so interesting. So there are two things that I'd love to hear your perspective on. On the one hand, and this is a long feminist conversation, is that when you have a case, when you have a body, when you have a woman's story in front of you who's claiming a narrative, and you ask her to say it over and over again, that's re-traumatizing, right? So there's this question of if by making someone say their story over and over again, are you actually, in a lot of ways, adding to that trauma and adding to the trauma of others by forcing them to come forward, right? So this. And the fact that there are many, many people who will not participate in this because it's too traumatizing to have to go through this. So that's, one problem. But the other is that it gives you this false sense that if we just knew what happened, if Columbia just reopened this case and made a better ruling, then the whole thing would stop, which is actually not the case at all. Or at least I'd like to, do you think that if they did this, if they figured out what happened, if there was truth that was revealed, would this end? Would that end the movement?
Well, I don't think it's about, if only we knew these extra things about Emma's case, then, because I think we know her case really well, and I think everyone that I know who's heard it says, this is ridiculous, he should have been found responsible. So I don't think it's a matter of, if only we knew these.
But if only we knew why he wasn't found responsible. If only we could fire the person, because I'm thinking about this, right?
It's not one person. I've met all the people who are responsible for him getting away with it, and they are all collectively enabling, a lot of, misjustice. So I think, Emma's case is helpful, and also our movement has to be more than Emma. And I think it is more than Emma. I think she's a very helpful rallying symbol, and she is not an activist, she is an artist, and this is how she is, I think this is part of her healing process. So this is an interesting part of it too, is that I think for a lot of survivors who are sharing their stories publicly and participating in activism as a way of seeking justice, it is a deeply personal thing. Like, to be a part of activism is, for many people, their way of getting justice. It is their healing process. It is not outside of it, it is deeply connected to it. So I think the whole issue of opening up her case and, getting, I think, that decision, reconsidered is, for her individual sense of justice, that is what she needs, and I completely understand that. That is not what every survivor needs, and I think the movement is trying to expand our notion of what does justice look like, because there is no one version, and I think every single survivor has a different experience with sexual violence and understands it differently, and they have a different sense of what justice and healing would mean for them. So, and again, I think you're right to point out that there are downsides to having one individual and their case so open and so picked at by the media. But hopefully the conversation is focused on how this is what Emma needs, this is not what every single person needs, or this is the solution. Once her rapist is found responsible, then we can pack it up and go home. I wish that were the case, because that would be a little bit, that's a little bit easier to achieve than the eradication of rape culture. But I don't know. I think it is really challenging, and I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to see that balance of individuals who, just by the very nature of coming forward, and it's interesting, we refer to it as coming out as a survivor. So there's sort of a learning from other social justice movements and their terminology at play here in terms of, it's an analogy to coming out as queer or gay or lesbian or trans, and that, part of just really saying your truth is your activism, is your sense of justice, is your healing. So it's complicated. I think it's hard to, I think the whole personal political, having one story that's so high profile is really helpful. But again, we have to move beyond that, because it's exhausting to have to share over and over and over. And I think, Vanessa, some of your colleagues, not necessarily you, don't really know how to interview survivors. And I think there's a lot for journalists to learn about, could you really stop asking about that detail, because I don't want to talk about it. And I think there's sort of an interesting relationship between survivors and the media that maybe we can talk about too.
Yeah, I think that, Emma, I think, gave an interview where she talked about how she felt a little bit attacked that first week after she had the mattress, because, journalists were coming there and they wanted to talk to her, and a great journalist stops at nothing to get the interview, right? So they were going to get it one way or another, even if that meant really invading her personal space or sending weird emails or calling her names or whatever. I mean, this is, stuff that journalists unfortunately do every day. I think, I'm not that concerned about Emma's case being problematic, although now that you bring it up, I see what you're saying in terms of longevity. But to me, maybe because, as Mary Beth says, I have now heard this many, many, many times, I'm not that interested in the details of her case. Like, I really have heard the details of her case. But the image is so awesome, and the image is so powerful, and in some ways,
the image of her with the
mattress. I mean, because the man's name is out there, and if you want to go into a hole on the internet, you probably can and find a few snitches of information you would want to find. I don't know, I'm not that interested in him or the case. Like, I would be much more interested in hearing, like, who are these boys from Hobart and William Smith, and, like, what are their lives like right now? Like, I'm much more interested in hearing about some of the other perpetrators we've heard about, of which very, very little is known. But I think that, the likelihood of Columbia reopening the case is not huge. Perhaps if there was somebody else who wanted to bring a case, that would be more effective. I just think, I would assume that the thought is that the reason that they won't open it is because we have rules here, right? And that's the whole point of this, which is like, what are your rules that you have here that you're so proud of? And so, I think you're right, and I think that, as we were discussing earlier, and several students brought up with me, a lot of the key organizers are seniors. What happens next year? There are schools like Occidental where they did a ton of activism, it was really heated up, and people just started to graduate, and people started to get tired, and where it happens then. And then you got a lot of broken people, a lot of tired people, and if you don't bring up the next group, if you don't really look to the freshman and the sophomore and get them in the tradition, then you're probably not going to go someplace. And, the story then goes, but the universities know that, and that is possible. I mean, that's possibly the long game that they're aware of. I also think, in this whole discussion, we have not heard from an administrator wrestling with this issue, and I would love to hear. I think there is somebody at UNC who's part of the Title IX campaign, and there are a few here and there. But I think it would be really fascinating to know, like, what the thought process is when all this is going on.
I do want to open this up for questions from the audience, and if you guys have questions for each other, I do have one more question for you, so you guys have a little bit of time to think about things, and that's this, and this is something both of you have said. So, what does this new conversation? If we want to talk about what education looks like in this new era, what does this new conversation look like? What does it mean to educate faculty and staff? Because I think that's part of it, right? Is that if you want this conversation to go past the average length of a student's stay at a college, if you want there to be lasting change, there has to be a much, much larger conversation about consent, about how to talk to survivors, about how to talk about this in classrooms, outside of classrooms. But where does that start, and what does it look like to you? What can we do to help you?
I mean, it's overwhelming because there are probably 50,000 things I would like to see. So it's kind of hard to list them all. But to give you sort of the main highlights, I think, like I was saying in the beginning, like, we have to just rethink what it means to be educating people. And that involves rethinking what it means to teach. So, something that we've seen recently in the Title IX complaints that have come out, Princeton just had their decision publicized this week. They were found to be in violation of Title IX, And Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights basically said, these are the things that you have to do to be in compliance now. And unless you do, items 1 through 8, then we're revoking all federal funding, which is sort of one of the main tactics that student activists have for forcing their institutions to handle this issue. And so this kind of goes back to actually what you're saying about what happens when students graduate, because I think the idea for a lot of people is, okay, like I am going to be graduating, I did graduate, and I'm a complainant in our Title IX case, and so theoretically I'm still connected. Like when they eventually open our investigation, it's been several months now since we submitted it and still no response. Once that investigation is opened, there will be interviews with the complainants, there will be, those cases will be reopened. So in some ways, it's actually bringing in the state to kind of continue the work, or at least vouch for the work that student activists have been doing, which will probably, actually end up happening after most of us have graduated. So that's one of the benefits of filing these Title IX complaints, is ensuring that the work that's been done is actually going to be enforced, and that there will be somebody who's not going to graduate in 3 years from the Department of Education saying, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to be here until this is done, otherwise, all of your federal funding is gone. So that's, both a sort of solution and also definitely not the whole solution. Because I think it's a brilliant move to use Title IX complaints in this movement, but it's also really easy to get into a culture of compliance where a school just says, okay, well, I have to have, education of faculty, so let's force everybody to take this online 1-hour module, and then we can check off the box saying like, woohoo, we educated our faculty on like how to support survivors, when they just muted video and like did other things for 60 minutes, So, it's not enough to have the piece of paper from the government saying, do this or we're gonna get really mad at you. You actually have to have a meaningful cultural like revolution, essentially, which is hopefully happening. And what that looks like is, not consent education for an hour, but consent education for a week, where you actually talk about, the patriarchy, and you talk about institutional racism, and you talk about how sexual violence plays into those things, and you talk about how you can actually not only have good consent practices, but be a better supporter of survivors, and how you can undo rape culture in your day-to-day life. That's not something you can talk about in 60 minutes. You need at least a week to discuss that. And that's asking for a lot, but I think schools that have billion-dollar endowments can figure it out. And then, again, it's not just having it your first year, it's having it your second semester your first year, your first semester second year. It's having this conversation revisited over and over again, to the point that it's not something that you can shove aside and say, oh yeah, that Consent 101 workshop, I remember that and I blew it off. It's something that you can't ignore. And then having faculty actually go through that conversation too. And educating faculty, because they may feel like, oh, I'm like, in my 40s, I understand what consent is, but many of them probably don't, and I think those definitions evolve as they should, and to leave professors out of that conversation is not helpful. So making sure professors understand what consent means, but also teaching them how, because it's shocking how few people understand what you should say when someone says, I was raped, or I'm a survivor, and I need help. Very few people understand what a helpful response there is, and it's something that you can teach, to people. It's not impossible. Like if you have good people teaching professors, they will learn and they will understand how to be more compassionate. So I think the thing, the goals are so lofty, and they may seem like, oh my gosh, we're never going to do this, and that can be super overwhelming, and it happens to me all the time. I'm like, oh, this is so tiring, and this movement is like amazing, but I don't, what are we working towards? Like, what's going to happen? Are we going to be able to keep this up for longer than a year? What happens when people get tired of this? And the answer is you have to institutionalize the culture that you want to see in some ways, and empower people to kind of be in dialogue with that, that institution. So it's not about the demands X, Y, and Z. It's, can we revisit these demands in 2 years to see if we made any progress? Do students have a voice in the reform process? Do we regularly revisit our sexual assault policies and refresh them so that they're culturally relevant? There's so many things that need to happen, and it's overwhelming. But when you actually sit down to think about like what these demands look like in real terms, they're doable. Like, they're things that can happen, and we've effectively changed our cultural mindset to a lot of things. Like drunk driving, we have effectively condemned. Ideally, we have condemned racism. Of course, people are still racist, but it's harder to excuse it publicly. So we have seen a lot of shifts in mindset that have taken time and hard work, but it's possible, and that's it's hard work, but I think people are getting there, and now the key is just making sure that there's someone to hold people accountable for the demands that we're making.
Does anybody want to give everybody in the audience a chance if anyone has a question?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about affirmative consent specifically. I mean, I have like a general understanding of it, but I'm just curious how that plays into a lot of the campus activism. And so also if you could talk about the difference between like reforms in universities as opposed to like activism reforms for like local government, or like when rapes are reported to like the police, like why university communities, why that? I mean, I'm guessing because there's more potential for change in like an academic setting because it's more focused on students, whereas like trying to change how your local precinct handles reporting rape is kind of a different community issue. So I'm wondering if you could talk about those two things a little bit.
Well, I'll talk about the second one, and you talked about affirmative consent, which I don't know as much about what's going on with that at this point. I mean, I would say that one of my first questions was, why don't you just go to the police? And I did learn, after asking it a million times, that did not make sense. And so, but it did take me a little while to grasp the concept of it. I mean, first of all, it's the law, right? Title IX makes it the law that you should be able to go to school without facing the fear of gender-based violence. So there doesn't really need to be a discussion about that. But even though that may be a little hard to grasp at a place like NYU when you're dispersed and it's a big city campus, certainly if you were at Gallatin, which is a small school, and the perpetrator was here, that would not be something that would be conducive to study for an individual. Leaving aside that also the police have a pretty bad track record for the most part with rape, I think that related to what Mary Beth was saying, what all this stuff doesn't need to be like homework. It doesn't need to be like, oh no, I'm gonna go learn about patriarchy now and all this sexual assault stuff that's so horrible. It should be a call to your higher self, which is what the university is supposed to be about. It's a time where you're supposed to be able to explore the best sides of yourself, figure out who you want to be, and if it's a slightly higher standard at schools, which I think in some cases it is, and certainly with affirmative consent, until you have affirmative consent for the citizenry, it is a higher standard. Then maybe that's part of what being at a university is about. And I think that could be a really nice message for people to take away. Just call to your more decent higher self to try to bring that into the situation, not only in your own experiences sexually, but also as a bystander, or just, being thinking differently about the way the genders relate than the way you were brought up to think. And so, yeah, but why don't you talk about affirmative consent? Because that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, I think, kind of a new-ish conversation, at least to a mainstream conversation or mainstream media in terms of what is affirmative consent. So the short answer is affirmative consent is, a practice and a process of approaching any sexual relationship, not assuming consent and then waiting for someone to say no, but rather assuming that no consent is given and looking for positive indicators of consent, and really getting verbal indication that someone or your partner or partners are fully enthusiastic and okay with what's going on and on the same page. So a lot of people kind of have a lot of questions about affirmative consent and feel like they feel like it's this like ridiculous standard, like how could anybody actually do this? Like it seems so awkward, and are you supposed to sign a contract? Like, how do you actually do this in real life? And that's kind of what hopefully these consent education trainings and discussions that we're asking for are exposing students to like actually give them real tools to be able to talk about sex in a way that's not embarrassing, where you don't have to like make it cutesy in order to really understand how it works. But the general idea is, do we want to live in a world where you assume that you have the consent for everyone around you, in terms of taking up space on the subway, or running into someone on the sidewalk, or in general, just like respecting other people's bodies? Do you want to live in a world where you assume that you have the right to everyone's body and you just wait for them to give you a negative indication? Or do you want to completely flip that, dynamic and flip that thinking and say, I actually don't have the right to anyone's body, and if I want to, have some sort of sexual relationship with someone, then I need to ask, and I need to make sure it's very clear that that person is fully on board with what's happening, and not just that they're on board, but they're like excited about it. And I think this is, connecting to other sort of like sex positive ways of articulating consent that people may have heard before, but framing it within the sort of anti-sexual violence debate kind of freaks people out because they think, like if I don't do it, like, everyone must be raping everyone, or it's very hard for people to understand, but it's really kind of a simple idea that is shockingly easy to do, and the reason it's so shockingly easy is because if you're not sure, then you just ask, and that should usually clear things up. So I think the reason people are pushing that is not only because it liberates people to be able to say no if they want to, when they may feel pressured or coerced, or like they are supposed to be saying yes all the time, and that they aren't allowed to exercise that no. It's great for that reason, but it also is helpful in a sort of hearing panel or adjudication process where a lot of administrators will say, well, like, what did you, how many times did you say no? And how loudly did you say no? How loudly did you scream? Did you fight back? And having an affirmative consent standard means you're no longer in an adjudication process forcing the complainant to prove that rape happened. You're forcing the perpetrator to prove that they had consent. And so it's empowering both to an individual in their own sex lives, but it's also empowering to survivors who are going through an adjudication process, not to have to feel like they have to essentially defend their right to their own bodies, but rather that someone else has to defend or explain and illustrate and justify whether they actually had real consent. Does that make sense?
One of the things is that that I've seen in the last 10 years is, it used to be that there was a discussion about how to prevent sexual assault, and it went something like this. It was like, 10 ways to prevent sexual assault, carry a whistle, use the box, right? And you're all laughing, and that was the way it was. And then in the last 10 years, this has flipped. And so there's, Take Back the Night has done this as well. There are these posters now that say 10 ways to, avoid sexual assault. Don't rape people, right? And I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think of affirmative consent that way. And I also think that it's, and this is the sort of sexuality studies scholar in me coming out for a moment, it's about really putting first that it's important to talk about sex as, and to have conversations about sex as a pleasurable activity. and there was this great, because in all of this all hinges on the questions about sex education, and there's a lot of discussion about, parents and children and what you should teach children at what age, and this is also a very active thing going on right now. And I think these two things are absolutely connected. And there's a very powerful article, and I can't remember who wrote it, who says basically, this woman says, what would happen, what would it look like if we taught children that sex was for pleasure, that it wasn't for procreation, but if that was the starting point. And I think in a lot of ways that a lot of these conversations come out of a larger discussion of how we feel about sex, and it feeds into, and it's a gendered issue, it's a classed issue, it's difficult.
And I think one thing that this conversation is bringing in a mainstream way is people saying not only, okay, I recognize this event in my own life was assault and I need to process it, but that's, we were talking earlier about how in some ways there's an inclination to want to identify with the assaulter to just not feel the pain of what the person who is the survivor has felt. Like, you want to make excuses for that person and say, no, it wasn't so bad, you needed me, and because you really have somebody who's in so much pain. And if you start looking at your own life and the things that have happened to you, you're probably going to identify some moments that you didn't like so much either. And I think that that's, this very quintessentially American thing where we have this really Puritan history, and yet we're living in this so overly commercialized and sexualized culture that uses sex to sell everything, right? From like shampoo to tie pins to like cars. I mean, there's nothing that you can't sell with sex. So I think it's just been, a complicated thing for people to try to process that. But the more that happens, the better, because it really is about people in America becoming more sensitive to some of these issues. Now, I'm not saying this is what it's all about, but it's a good step. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
How can we, as a culture, negotiate the very complicated issues of female sexuality that there is a reality that a lot of women do want, as far as sexual fantasy is concerned, they do want to be objectified, sort of things. They do, rape fantasies are real for a lot of women and for other people. How do we negotiate those from a sex positive standpoint, but at the same time still reaffirming that even when those fantasies are present, the desire or demand for sexual autonomy and preventing sexual violence. How do we improve that?
So it sounds like the question is, how do we reconcile the fact that there is a BDSM community and the fact that we want to value consent? And I think those things are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, I think members of the BDSM community would tell you that consent is like the entire point of that community. And people who have those fantasies, it's not to say that those fantasies are we should ban people from having them, but there still needs to be an ongoing consent practice associated with that. And moreover, I think we all need to kind of reflect on, that fantasy does not exist in a vacuum, right? That people who are interested in, that expression of their sexuality, as long as they're practicing with consent, fine. But at the same time, that fantasy came out of an education by a culture in which rape is normalized, and we, basically enable sexual violence as a collective. So I think there's two answers to your question. The first is that, consent is actually very crucial to the BDSM community, and I think people who are inside of it would say the perception that it's not about consent is actually, perpetuated by abusers within the community who try to kind of hide behind that, that identity in order to get away with their abuse, but that most people within the community actually are extremely diligent about their consent practices. So that's the one side of it, but also, hopefully this movement is getting all of us to reflect on our own experiences and think about, why is this something that I would find pleasurable? What is it about the images that I've seen, the books that I've read, the messages about sex that I've been taught, that this is something that I feel would be exciting to me? And that's not to say that, for every single person, it's like, oh, like rape culture, is around me, and I've been around it for so long, and I only have this fantasy because of rape culture. But at the same time, I think there does have to be, the willingness to be critical of yourself and think maybe I have actually contributed to rape culture in some way, or it has slipped into my life in these ways, and how can I be honest with myself and work to undo that on a very personal level, because I am a part of this culture in which rape culture exists. Does that make sense?
Well, there's also, and this is something I think about a lot, is that I think it's actually, there's a difference between, I think about it a lot, but I have a hard time articulating it, sorry. There is a very fine line for many people between pleasure and shame. And there are very complicated reasons for that. And there are complicated sociological reasons and psychological reasons. But when you're talking about consent, you have to remember the following. Sex, in as much as it is an act that happens between people, requires empathy. And it is not enough to think you know what someone else is feeling. You have to move beyond that and actually feel what they're feeling. And I have never, in all of the things that I have studied and all the people that I've talked to, never talked to somebody who participated in BDSM or talked about rape fantasies or talked about these very sort of, what for many of us are gray areas, who could not tell the difference between somebody who was actively participating in something they enjoyed and somebody who was being hurt in a way that they did not enjoy. And that is really what it is. It is difficult for human beings to empathize with other people, and it's difficult to really reconcile that. And this gets at, both of you have said this, that one of the hardest things about this whole conversation on college campuses is when anybody questions an act, when anybody questions any type of sex, it reverberates down the entire community. And I, as a listener, can hear back in I can hear my own experiences, and that it can be very troubling. And I think that that dealing with that discomfort and learning how to work through it is really part of the education that you guys are talking about. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, given that this is a larger cultural political issue, and given that our systems of who and how we punish are fraught with their own systemic oppressions, and given that these instances are very personal and individualized issues, how can we create policies to deal with perpetrators, and what can retribution and restoration for the survivor look like?
Well,
theories of justice right now.
But I mean, I think that you have heard a lot of people in this movement start to say they should be expelled. And I think from a rational point of view, if you say, let me read you back exactly what this guy was found responsible for, since we don't use the word guilty, and it says, sexual misconduct involving threat of injury or, various bad things, which certainly fit even the criminal justice's, definition of rape. Why would you let this person back on your campus? You found him responsible of this. This is what you said. You're gonna make him go away for a semester, and then he gets to come back. So I think that's again very effective. It's rational. As far as shaming perpetrators, I think that is a pretty good tool when you really look at it. Definitely could potentially get out of control. It's the thing really that the colleges are the most afraid of, other than the effect on endowments and bad media attention, because it kind of implies an unruly group of students who are not, again, abiding by the laws. So I think it's much more threatening. The public shaming aspect of it is really seen as a very serious move by the administration. And it's interesting to think, is it really that serious? Why is this so serious? Particularly if it's about the wall and it's not on the internet, where you feel like, oh no, now the world knows it. I don't know. I mean, that's something that people used in the 90s and was pretty effective in the 90s. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear you mention sort of the fact that for pretty much every adjudication process, the approach is one in which the goal is to punish the perpetrator and kind of ignore the needs of the survivor beyond a sanction. So, and I think a lot of people articulate this in a framework of restorative justice. So thinking about, not to say that expulsion is not an option, but for many survivors, they might have a vision of justice that doesn't include expulsion, doesn't include rejecting someone from a community. And I think you see this especially in cases of dating violence, which are not really as, I would say, covered in mainstream media right now, which is starting to change. But for many people, the idea of if I went and reported my assailant or my perpetrator or my abusive partner, and the only option is to expel them from the community, then that may not be a very appealing option for many people for a lot of reasons. Maybe this person, really, despite the person being abusive, they still love them and care for them, and are looking for things that will be healing for them. So re-education of the perpetrator, forcing them to go through consent education, or education that's specifically anti-sexist, or counseling for both the perpetrator and the survivor, academic accommodations. So there are a lot of things that we don't traditionally think about being a part of the equation in terms of reporting and why someone would report and what they would want to get out of reporting. But hopefully we're thinking about, for many people, they really want their perpetrators expelled. And Emma, for example, has said in very clear terms, I want my rapist to be expelled. And what I think the movement in general is pushing for is not, these are the sanctions that should be given for X Act and Y Act and Z Act, and under no circumstances should we give anything other than this sanction. Instead, it's saying, let's actually listen to survivors and hear what they want. Like, what does justice look like for them? And the idea of there being some, administrative entity that decides what justice looks like for every single person who experiences specific acts is actually very disempowering for the survivor. And ideally, we're working towards a system in which, there isn't sort of a slate of options that, the hearing panelists or a university or a dean would decide, but instead, you go through the process. If the person is found responsible, you ask the survivor, what would justice look like for you? And that's a kind of radical idea for a lot of people that shouldn't be radical. Like asking, like, what actually would make this better for you? What do you need to heal? What do you need to feel like justice has been done? And that may include, expulsion. That may include counseling. That may include, reparations or financial restitution. There are a lot of things that can include, and it could be all of those things or only one of those things. And ultimately, hopefully we're approaching this from a perspective in which we're listening to survivors, because it's the only way we're going to know, what justice looks like for them. So I think that's, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. And there was your, there you are.
I'm a senior in high school, and I have a feminist group. And when I walk out in the hallway and I see all the other people in high school, it's really different from in the classroom to outside. And it kind of scares me. All my friends going off to college next year, being alone. And I was wondering, how do you, after someone rapes someone, and I don't really know my question, but after someone rapes someone and they have something happen to them, but how do you teach people beforehand, before they rape people? I think that's the more important thing, instead of saying what happens after they rape someone, but what happens before they rape someone. And with all rape culture going on, everything around media and what we're talking about, how do you teach boys and girls what rape is and how to not do it when it's so prevalent in our society?
Great question, and I'm really glad that you're here. This is great that we have high school people. We hopefully are getting this conversation to younger and younger folks. And there's actually a great article on Everyday Feminism about ways that you can teach consent from birth to age 18 at age-appropriate levels that I think is exactly the answer to your question. So a lot of this, comes from parents, but a lot of it comes from teachers as well within K-12 education, which Title IX is actually includes K-12 education, which a lot of people don't know. But so, essentially the idea is, how do we teach people to value consent, and how do we both teach people who might potentially perpetrate violence against another not to do that, but also how do we empower communities and help communities stand in solidarity with the survivor if they do experience violence? Because I think a lot of research on the subject shows that in communities where perpetrators feel like they have the license to operate, which is basically, do they feel like in that community, if they perpetrated violence against someone, nobody would hold them accountable, or people would turn away, or sweep it under the rug, then that person's actually much more likely to perpetrate violence. So, consent education plays an extremely important role, not only in educating people on what consent actually is and how to give it and how to get it, but also it empowers communities to understand what that looks like and be more empathetic with survivors. And if they do, if someone does name a perpetrator within that community, people who go through consent education are much more likely to condemn that behavior. And if there's a pattern of condemning perpetrators rather than condemning survivors, then that kind of has like a ripple effect that empowers survivors in the future and prevents perpetrators from feeling like they get away with violence. So essentially, we're asking for consent education from day one of kindergarten, essentially. And that doesn't necessarily mean saying to 5-year-olds like, this is what you say when you're having sex with someone. Instead, it's little things like asking before you hug someone, are you a hugger or not really? And that small little thing of asking for someone's permission before you touch them is actually huge. And teaching children, like, it's actually, you can say to grandma, like, I don't really want to give you a kiss goodbye, but I'll like wave goodbye or give you a high five or something like that. And teaching kids that there are ways of showing love that don't require physical touch, and you're not failing, or it's not that you don't love someone if you don't express yourself through hugs or kisses or whatever it may be. So the messaging kind of can be altered for all different ages, and I think as kids mature, you can also mature the content of that messaging. But essentially, it's on parents, it's on teachers, it's on elders within a community, it's on everybody. Not to use the language of the It's On Us campaign, but it's on all of us to get that message across to young people and to support survivors. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but yeah.
All right, that was a great question. Thank you, and thank all of you for coming out tonight, and thank you guys for leading us in this.
I also want to thank everybody, and I also wanted to add thanking Kristen Horton for inviting us to do this event. Thank Suzanne Wofford, the Dean of Gallatin, for supporting us. Thank John Paolo Baiocchi, the director of the Urban Democracy Lab, for supporting this. And all the people in the technical realm who have helped to videotape and make all of the sound work. So thank all of you too.